Hello, our class today is about the concept of security. We are going to take a look at how we can approach security, what are the theoretical tools to study security. We will look at some of the changes during the Cold War and after the Cold War in how academic studies approached the concept of security. And then in other classes, we will look at specific segments of security, such as environmental security, human security, military security. And this is basically slides. We are going to go through the slides. These are the slides in the PowerPoint presentation that I sent you last week. So you can find it in Google, also Google Classroom. And here, in addition to the slides, I'm going to also explain what is meant by the expressions in the slides, and we will just go in parallel, in tandem with the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so what is security? Let's start with the realist paradigm, which is the maybe the basic, most well-known approach in international relations. How do realists approach the concept of security? According to the realist paradigm, mostly realist scholars looked at security from the lens of military security and power maximization. So for them, security mostly concerned the security of states. So they didn't really write or make research about human security, for example, but mostly state-based approach. Their approach was based on state and state security, and they basically looked at the concepts of national security and national interest, because foreign policy and security policy was based on national interest. They looked at how the national interest was, let's say, how it was defined, and they looked at the power resources of states in order to maximize their power and reach the foreign policy objectives that would be most in line with their national interest. And in the security strategies that states used in the realist approach, we also came across several concepts such as balance of power, deterrence, bandwagoning, and preemptive strike. Balance of power was mostly during the 18th century what we have seen in Europe, the balance of power politics, and how the emergence of a new power was tried to be balanced by a coalition of other states, and how they also maybe prevented the let's say conglomeration of power resources in one state alone. So when, for example, Germany unified and became a unified state at the end of the 19th century, then the other countries tried to set limits to the rise in power of Germany, so they implemented balance of power strategies. Deterrence is usually a term which was very much studied during the nuclear era after the ending of the Second World War, when first the United States became the first country that used nuclear power, followed by the Soviet Union in 1949. And they use nuclear deterrence against each other. For example, countries, let's say, when they are dealing with a country that has nuclear power, they would think twice before engaging in any aggressive behavior, any aggressive action against that state. The nuclear power that these states had would act as a deterrent against any sort of claims or aggressive strategies by other states. So if you are dealing with a nuclear power, then you would be more cautious than if you were dealing with a country which did not really have those military power resources. There were also some other strategies like bandwagoning, for example. In bandwagoning, usually you have a dominant power, and there are some smaller or medium-sized powers that acted in accordance with the policies, the recommendations of that dominant power. So they were bandwagoning. They were just basically chasing the dominant power and acting in line with its interests, so that they expected the dominant power to also protect their interests in return. So it was mostly a strategy which was used by smaller countries, less powerful countries, acting in line with the commitments, with the policies of larger, more important powers. And then another term, preemptive strike. This was mostly, again, a strategy which was used in order to maximize power and in order to maximize security. So here, if you think that another country, another power may become threatening, may become a threat in the near future, before that power, that country uses this power against you, you strike against that country. So it is a preemptive strike. It is a strike which is conducted in order to prevent that country from engaging in aggressive behavior against you. So it is before that country takes action, you take action against the other country. So it is, again, a very realistic sort of strategy. Then we look at another realist writer, Walter Lippmann, who actually also was the person who popularized the term Cold War, which was a term which was used during the, especially the post-Second World War era. And this was in 1943. There is a, let's say, quotation from Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann was a journalist, actually, but he also was influential in terms of describing the relations between countries during the Cold War era. So he said, a nation has security when it does not have to sacrifice its legitimate interests to avoid war and is able, if challenged, to maintain them by war. So according to this understanding, according to Lippmann's understanding, it doesn't mean that a nation which is powerful should always be ready to go to war, but a country should have enough resources, especially in terms of military power, in terms of army, and if challenged by another country, then it may, at the last instance, may go to war. It will not be frightened of going to war, and in order to avoid war, it will not sacrifice its legitimate interest. So war is a probability, though maybe it may be a probability that should be used as a last resort. So not, I mean, immediately just jumping into a war, but if you are challenged, for example, if another country, let's say, wants to annex a territory from your country, so you say, okay, I will not do that. This is my territory. It is my national integrity, and you should have sufficient resources to tell the other country, which is trying to annex land from your country. You should have sufficient resources to say, okay, I will not give any territory to you, and if you are determined to use force against my country, I have military force, and I will I will never be frightened to use my military power against you. So this is, war may be a possibility, and you can have enough power to go to war against other countries, but of course, if they are threatening your legitimate interests, like maybe territory, or maybe another, let's say, it may be a dispute over an important natural resource, etc. And if these conditions are met, then we may say that this country, this nation, has security. So military power is essential in order to really say, okay, I have security for a state. Then we, of course, you all know about Hans Morgenthau, who is, again, a very important writer, a theoretician of realism, the realist school of thought. And we also have another quotation from Hans Morgenthau. He was especially prominent in the 1950s, and writing in 1972, he said that the nation state is to a higher degree than ever before the predominant source of the individual's moral and legal valuations and the ultimate point of reference for his secular loyalties. Consequently, its power among the other nations and the preservation of his sovereignty are the individual's foremost concerns in international affairs. So, we are determined in this understanding that the state is the primary actor. It is the predominant source of an individual's moral and legal valuations, and it is our ultimate point of reference. Because as individuals, our security is dependent on the state, on the security of the state that we live in. So, in this understanding, the focus is on the security of the state rather than individuals or citizens of the state. And the nation state's power among the other nations and the preservation of its sovereignty are the individual's foremost concerns in international affairs. So, because our security is tied to the security of the state that we live in, we can only be secure if our state is powerful and if it is powerful enough to preserve its sovereignty. So, our security is directly linked with the security of the state. So, of course, this is true to an extent because usually, if let's say there is a complete, crush, a complete destruction of state institutions, let's say there is anarchy. For example, you cannot go out the street because you don't know if you are going to be robbed or if somebody will come and attack you, etc. You have no security because of the lack of state institutions. Then this means that, of course, having a state, living in an effective state, efficient state, is something very important for your security because the state will protect the laws, it will protect your own safety, etc. But of course, we will look at later that this may not be sometimes enough, and sometimes the state may not really be sufficient to really create all the conditions for the security of human beings. So, of course, preservation of the state, national sovereignty, integrity of the state is very important. But as we will see later, there are also some other maybe areas of research for security. Security dilemma is another, again, very important concept which is used by realists. In this understanding, the security, the search for optimal security, let's say, by states may create a paradoxical situation. Actions taken by a state to increase its own security may cause reactions from other states, and this in turn leads to a decrease rather than an increase in the original state's security. In the international arena, of course, we know that we are in an anarchic situation in accordance with the realist understanding. So there is no legitimate authority and there is no legitimate monopoly of violence. There is no world government. And as a consequence, each state must take care of its own security. The primary goal of states is to maximize their own security. However, many of the actions that states take in pursuit of that goal will necessarily decrease the security of other states. So let's say in this understanding, there is always a willingness and a search for maximization of security by states. So each state wants to be powerful. They think that only if they are powerful, they can be secure in this world of anarchy because there is no world authority. We have international law, but the subjects of international law are states, and we do not really have mechanisms which will tell states what to do or what not to do. We have the United Nations, of course, as a mechanism of collective security, but most often we see that the United Nations mechanisms for security in the world do not function properly. So we may, as states, we may feel that our existence is under threat from other states. So we want to maximize our security, we want to maximize our power resources in order to reach a state of security. However, this is not a static, let's say, concept. I mean, we cannot say, okay, if we have 100 tanks, then we will be secure. We cannot say that. It is a relative concept. So we are always trying to calculate our security, our power resources in relation with other states, especially in relation with powerful states and in relation with the states in our neighborhood, especially our closest neighbors, because threat may come from them. It's easier, the probability is higher. So in our neighborhood, in our geographical region, and also in terms of global powers, we basically compare our power resources with other countries that we are interested in, and from which we may also we may perceive a threat to our security. But what do we do in order to maximize our situation in terms of security? We invest in more military technologies. We invest in weapons. We try to build a powerful army. We buy new technologies, new destructive technologies. We buy planes, war planes. We buy, let's say, a lot of weapons, tanks. We also invest in soldiers, etc. So we try to build a powerful army. If possible, we also may invest in nuclear technology, nuclear weapons. We may enter into alliances in order to maximize our security. But our strategies in order to maximize our security may also create concern in other countries. So they may think that, oh, okay, this country is investing so much in its military technologies, investing so much in its military power. Why is it doing it? It shouldn't be just for its own defense, but it may be for offensive purposes. So in the future, that country may contemplate attacking my country using this military power against me. So I should also engage in military power. I should be strong enough to prevent any attack from that country. So then that country engages in militarization, engages in investment in military technology. So it becomes like such a race, a process of militarization, a military competition between countries. And what one country is doing in order to maximize its security may cause insecurity for other countries, and they try to also engage in militarization in order to decrease the security concerns. So it becomes like a dilemma, like a race, a competition for more power, more security. In order to limit such, let's say, uncontrolled races, arms races, uncontrolled military competitions, then maybe some form of international cooperation, some form of security architecture should be maintained so that states will not feel themselves isolated, and they will not continuously invest in military technologies. During the Cold War, we talked a bit about the establishment of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and we said that it became the number one security organization, collective defense organization for the transatlantic region, including both the United States, Canada, and West European countries. It also included Greece and Turkey. Also, we talked about another organization, which was the Western European Union, which was based on the Brussels Treaty. But during the Cold War, the Western European Union was not really a very active organization. It was mostly dormant during the Cold War eras. When we look at the NATO strategies during the Cold War, we may talk about two important strategic conceptions. One in the 1950s, and then we had a change in 1967 with a change to what was called as the flexible response strategy. This was like the military understanding, the military logic under NATO. For NATO, of course, one important enemy was the Soviet Union and the countries in the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Bloc in Eastern Europe. So there was a expectation of a military threat emanating from the Soviet Bloc, and this could take the form of either conventional forces, but because the Soviet Union also had nuclear power, nuclear weapons, it could also most probably entail the use of tactical and strategic nuclear weapons. In the 1950s, NATO strategy was defined in this concept as massive retaliation. So this meant that in case of an attack, retaliate with full military force, including the use of nuclear weapons. So this was based on the premise or on the assumption that the transatlantic bloc, NATO, was much more dominant against the Soviet Union in terms of both the breadth and the advanced nature of its nuclear arsenal. So it was much more powerful. It was ahead in nuclear technology. So if it used its nuclear power against the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union would not be able to stand against this power. So if we see even a conventional attack coming from the other side, from the Soviet side, we can retaliate with all the forces, with both conventional and nuclear forces that we have, and we can just annihilate the enemy. We can just get rid of the enemy because we are much more powerful in terms of nuclear capacity. So this was massive retaliation. So retaliate massively with all the power, both conventional and nuclear power that you have. However, during the 1950s, we also see that the Soviet Union also invested a lot in this nuclear technology, and it became more or less equal, or at least challenging the nuclear power and the nuclear technology that the United States had and NATO had. Of course, there were also maybe sometimes some exaggerations about the Soviet power in the nuclear arsenal, but one could never be sure because I mean there were these satellite systems, etc., that the powers have in today's world. So there was also an understanding that the Soviet Union was catching up with the United States in nuclear technology. So this actually put into question this strategy of massive retaliation, because if the other power, if your enemy also has enough capacity to retaliate against you, then you will think twice before using any sort of nuclear power against the enemy. So there was a change to the strategy of flexible response, responding to a crisis by proportional means and with gradual use of non-military and military tools. So first, it was a sort of like a step-by-step strategy. Let's say there is a aggression from the neighbor. Let's say they are trying to maybe intervene into Western European affairs. They are trying to maybe let's say engage in some attacks against, let's say, West Germany, etc. And there is a situation where NATO has to react. So when engaging in a, let's say, an attack against the enemy, use proportional means. So first maybe there could be diplomacy, and then some conventional power could be used, and technical, tactical nuclear weapons could be used, and then at the end maybe the most destructive weapons can be used, but only as a last resort. So it is a step-by-step strategy rather than a massive use of power against the enemy. And this was basically the world of MAD, meaning mutually assured destruction. So it meant that when the enemy possesses the capacity to retaliate with nuclear weapons, threat of annihilation for both sides. So there is always the possibility of second strike. In the first case, in massive retaliation, the enemy does not have the power to hit back. So if you hit if you are the one that hits first, then you will definitely win the war because you are much more powerful in terms of nuclear technology, nuclear capability. But when your enemy catches up in terms of nuclear power, then you see that your enemy also has enough capacity to retaliate with nuclear weapons. So this will be annihilation for both. For both the party which attacks first and the party which retaliates, mutually assured destruction. So this necessitated a change in strategy, and it also made let's say the possibility of a nuclear war less likely, because neither the United States nor the Soviet Union would dare to use its nuclear power, because they would fear that they would also be annihilated because the other party has the power to strike back. However, in this understanding, let's say what we are mostly talking about is, of course, security, military power, deterrence, MAD, mutually assured destruction, etc. So we are mostly talking about the security of states and the probability of war. So what we are talking about is, first of all, how we can avoid war, And if we have to go to war, then will we win? Do we have enough power? Do we have enough military power in order to win a war if we have to go into a war? And security is mostly linked to power, how much power you have, and relative power against your enemies, against your competitors. So it is a very hostile world, a world where you cannot really guess what kind of threats may come against you. But it is mostly, as we said, related to power, military force, military capability, and state security. So this is mostly what is called as a limited conceptualization of security. Wirtz, writing in 2002, mostly tells about this limited conceptualization of security, and he says that if the threat of force, the use of force, even the logistical or technical assistance that can be supplied by military units does little to respond to a given problem, it probably is best not to treat the issue as a security threat. So, this basically limits our understanding of what constitutes security and security threat. So, in order to classify an issue or treat an issue as a security issue, as a security threat, we should make sure that this threat of force, the use of force, or even the logistical or technical assistance that can be supplied by military units does little to respond to a given problem, then it is not a security threat. So a security threat, a security issue, should be an issue that can be treated, that can be, let's say, resolved by the threat of force, use of force, or military means. So it is mostly something that is related with the use of military forces, threat to use military forces. So only then can we basically discuss an issue under the umbrella of security, the security issue. So security is a more limited conception. It is related to state security, military security. However, during the 1970s, especially during the détente era of the Cold War, we begin to see a change in the, let's say, in the discussions about security. Security becomes something more, maybe, than just state security and military security. We begin to see the first signs, especially in the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, which was signed by both East European and West European countries. So it was actually a rapprochement between the East and West of Europe. So it meant that the clear distinctions, this clear, let's say, categorizations between the East and West Europe was also becoming maybe softer, becoming more flexible, and there was increasing cooperation, increasing contact between Western and Eastern Europeans. In the Helsinki Final Act, there was talk of a comprehensive approach to security, including protection of human rights. So it said in the Helsinki Final Act, recognizing the indivisibility of security in Europe as well as their common interest in the development of cooperation throughout Europe. So they were talking about cooperation. They weren't talking about the use of force, they weren't talking about military security, but they were talking about the probability of cooperation, which would actually be a factor contributing to security in Europe. And they were talking about indivisibility of security and common interest in the development of cooperation. So this was something which was more than just nuclear deterrence, massive response, flexible response, etc. So it was talking about security, but also it was talking about not only state security, but it was talking about security of human beings, security of individuals, separately from the security of the state. So security of the state is, of course, something which should always be taken into consideration, but it is not sufficient to discuss security. So there may be some other aspects, some other components of security, and human rights was given as a factor of security. There was also a declaration on principles guiding relations between participating states in the Helsinki Final Act. So this would be the first document which created the process which was called as the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It later turned into the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in 1995. However, at that time it was a conference, it was a process, not an institutionalized process, but it was a meeting of parties where they agreed on principles, they agreed on codes of conduct in order to bring security to the whole of Europe. So this was something, maybe a challenge to Cold War politics. It was something different than just we have NATO on one side, we have Warsaw Pact on the other side, and all the world revolves around this, let's say, competition, rivalry between these two blocs. So this was something different. It talked about the security of Europe as a whole, including both the eastern parts, the Soviet bloc, and the United States, the NATO bloc, and it wanted to create common principles. And it also had a vision of security which was not only limited to the military aspect, but it also involved the human rights aspect as well. So here we had, for example, in the Declaration of Principles, we also had, of course, state security, state sovereignty, sovereign equality, respect for the rights, inherent sovereignty, refraining from the threat of use of force, inviolability of frontiers, territorial integrity, peaceful settlement of disputes, non-intervention in internal affairs, but we also had principles, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. So this was included in what our concept of security. So we had a widening of the concept of security, not only limited to military security, because it also directly addressed the security of the individual. And it said that if you are not free, then you are not secure. Okay, maybe your borders are secure, the territory is secure, but if your citizens are not free, then you will not be secure. So it included, added a new element in our concept of security. Then we had the Independent Commission on International Development Issues in 1980. They also talked about a changing concept of security, and they said that an important task of constructive international policy will have to consist in providing a new, more comprehensive understanding of security. So this is quite important. New understanding of security, more comprehensive understanding of security, which would be less restricted to the purely military aspects. Our survival depends not only on military balance, but on global cooperation to ensure a sustainable biological environment based on equitable shared resources. So here again, it is questioning an understanding of security which is restricted to the purely military aspects, because it says that our survival depends not only on military balance but on global cooperation to ensure a sustainable biological environment based on equitable shared resources. So here again, we have an additional element. In addition to human rights, we have talk of our biological environment based on equitable shared resources. For example, we may also give an example, a current example. We are now talking about a virus, a very small, which we cannot see actually, but we know the existence of a virus which was called as COVID-19, the new coronavirus, which has created very harsh conditions. So we are talking about, let's say, very extraordinary conditions where people cannot leave their homes, let's say. In some countries, there are even, let's say, some punishment, some fines being implemented against individuals if they leave their homes for, let's say, just leisurely activities. So this is our primary security threat now. It is not something military. It does not come from a specific country. So it is transborder. We don't know when it enters the country. We don't know how or when it spreads throughout the country. We can just observe it, chase it, follow its movements around the world. But it's a common threat, and it directly concerns our security. But at the same time, 2 days ago, we have heard that North Korea, which is a dictatorship, actually engaged in a nuclear test. So they tested their nuclear weapons. So this really contrasts. I mean, when every one of the other countries are involved with this fight against the coronavirus, North Korea says, okay, it's not a concern of mine, but I have military power and I want to show the world that I have nuclear power, so I will test it. And this is also maybe a sign of defiance against the world. So they say, okay, it doesn't interest me, it doesn't, your virus doesn't interest me, but I am interested in showing the world my military power. So this is something like that. I mean, you can pile up your military power, you can have all the military power in the world, but a virus may just kill a percentage, an important percentage of your population. So security cannot be limited just to military power. So it is something beyond that. It includes human rights, it includes the protection of the environment, it includes shared resources. So if you have inequality in the world, then you cannot also be secure. If you have too much inequality, then this will mean that you will not have stability. Some countries will basically consume, really they will consume much more than they actually need, while people living in other countries will have much less resources. They will not have access to clean water, they will not have access to electricity, etc. So this will create inequality, uh, injustice in the world, and it will still be a threat to security. So security without freedom, security without justice, security without rights is also not security, maybe. Then we have another document, the African Leadership Forum. They also published a document about security in 1991. And they said that the concept of security goes beyond military considerations. It must be construed in terms of the security of the individual citizen to live in peace with access to basic necessities of life while fully participating in the affairs of his or her society in freedom and enjoying all fundamental human rights. So here again, we have a wider conception of security beyond military considerations, the security of the individual citizen to live in peace with access to the basic necessities of life while fully participating in the affairs of his or her society in freedom and enjoying all fundamental human rights. So there is much on the agenda here in our understanding of security. So it's not only military security. It is maybe an underlying necessity, but it is not limited to military security. It is the security of the individual citizen to live in peace with access to basic necessities of life while fully participating in the affairs of his or her society in freedom and enjoying fundamental human rights. United Nations perspective. This is from a document by the United Nations Development Program from 1993. They also propagated this wider concept of security, and they said that the concept of security must change from an exclusive stress on national security to a much greater stress on people's security, from security through armaments to security through human development, from territorial to food, employment, and environmental security. So here there is a challenge both. It is said that, okay, it's not only national security, but it's people's security. So no longer confined only to the security of the nation state, but to human security. Again, security is not only about military security, it's not only about armaments, it's not only about creating a large, powerful army, but it's about human development. And it's no longer territorial security only, it's no longer just protecting our borders, protecting our territory, but it's having food security, it's having employment and environmental security. So it is the ability to live in a clean environment, its ability to have access to resources, access to jobs, so that you can have a living for yourself and you can have a reason for living because you have a job, you are content with your job, you earn enough to have a decent life standard, etc. And food security is also another concept because, I mean, it has become one of the major issues in today's world. What are we eating? Is it good for our health? Is it hygienically also edible? Let's say something which we can eat, which will be also not harming our health. So food security is also a very, very important part of this new security understanding. To look at it in terms of the Cold War and the ending of the Cold War, After the ending of the Cold War, we have a reappraisal of the traditional approach to security. We had already, as we said, some, let's say, approaches starting from the 1970s, questioning the traditional realist paradigm in understanding security. So it said that, okay, we are no longer talking about just the traditional approach, state-based approach to security, because we are now talking about our understanding of security is now about a much wider and deeper conceptualization of this very important concept. Why do we have a change in this understanding? First of all, we have the ending of the rivalry between the superpowers. The threat of nuclear war became, let's say, less important maybe in comparison to some other threats. There are some new threats to security, and these concern both state security, human security, as we have talked about, environmental security, food security, human rights, human security, etc. So these new issues gain priority, and the old military-based and state-based understanding of security is no longer, let's say, relevant in the just immediate post-Cold War era. Again, later on, we will also have, of course, a return to state security and a return to conceptions of this more limited approach to security. But in general, we have seen in international relations, studies about security were now more interested in this wider and deeper conception of security. In 1983, we have Ullman defining threat to security as an action or sequence of events that threatens drastically and over a relatively brief span of time to degrade the quality of life for the inhabitants of a state, or threatens significantly to narrow the range of policy choices available to a government of a state or to private non-governmental entities within the state. So it is no longer just concerning, our security understanding is no longer just concerning state and state institutions, and it is no longer just concerned about threats to the existence of the state, territorial integrity, independence of the state, etc. But it says that an action or sequence of events threatening drastically and over a relatively brief span of time. So it will be something quite unexpected, something that has a lot of impact on the quality of life for the inhabitants of a state. So it may be like something like a Chernobyl disaster, for example. It happened and it just basically either people were killed or they were very much badly affected from the consequences of this nuclear disaster. So anything that would degrade the quality of life for the inhabitants of a state, or threaten significantly to narrow the range of policy choices available to a government of a state or to private non-governmental entities within the state. So it would again not only threaten significantly to narrow the range of policy choices to governments, but also to private non-governmental entities within the state. So it could be like maybe a trade war. It does not have to be necessarily always a military threat or the use of force, but it may be something like a trade war, as we have seen between the United States and China recently, or it may be a nuclear disaster. It may be something like this virus, again, which created a drastic change, a degradation in our quality of life. It also was a major threat to the economy of the countries because of the, let's say, the interruption of consumption and production patterns. So we have two approaches and two sets or two schools of thought in this new approach to security, which actually saw the realist, more limited approach to security as limited. We had wideners and deepeners. Wideners insisted on the need to include non-military issues which affect security of the state. So it's no longer just military issues, but all kinds of environmental, human rights related, biological issues, etc. They can be also the subject of security, non-military issues. And deepeners, in addition to widening the issues, they shifted the focus to the security of people rather than the state. So it's no longer just the state security that we are talking about, but we are talking about human security, we are talking about the security of ethnic groups, the security of human groups, we are talking about non-governmental entities, they may be economic actors, they may be civil society. So we are talking about not only state security, but much more different elements, human security and human groups, security of human groups other than just the state, and the wideners needing to include conceptions of security not only limited to military issues but non-military issues as well, economic security, cultural security, environmental security, etc. The realist approach in this understanding contested the widening of the concept of security. So they said that if you actually widen the realm of security, so if you take anything as a security threat or non-military issues, also non-state security issues, etc., then this will be a concept which will be impossible to define. Walt, for example, said that security studies may be defined as the study of the threat, use, and control of military force. So it is limited understanding, limited to the use, the threat, use, and control of military force. And he said that widening the definition of security can render the concept redundant by making it too all-encompassing and diluting the task of analyzing military threats and interstate conflicts. So they said that, okay, if you widen the concept, then if you put everything into it, if you say, we can talk about environmental security, human security, cultural security, food security, then it will become such a wide implementation of the concept that it will be very difficult to actually study it, because it will be so much expanded, the concept, and it will be so much diluted that it will be impossible to actually scientifically analyze the concept. So we should keep it limited. We should find another concept for the other areas, but security, as the traditional understanding of security in international relations, should be defined as a study of the threat, use, and control of military force. Then, in contravention of this limited understanding, we have talk of new threats, we have more wider and deeper understanding of security, and we talk about new threats. So the primary threats to human existence are not the same as in the Cold War. They do not always come from the military area. They do not always come from the use of force or military use of force, but we have a lot of other sources of security threats. And these were again defined by writers, academics, especially after the 1980s and especially during the post-Cold War era. So, for example, Ullman, writing in 1983, talked about demographic pressures and resource depletion. Matthews, writing in 1989, talked about environmental problems such as ozone depletion and global warming. And Ayub, writing in 1997, talked about internal rather than external threats as previsible security concerns, especially for least developed countries of the world. So now we are talking about a proliferation, an increase in the number of sources, origins of security threats.